Good morning, class. Thank you for being here. We are ready to start. Let me open this up in prayer, and we'll get into our deep dive in the book of Numbers. Lord God, please join us this morning. Thank you for preserving your word, for allowing us the chance to read it, to read books that maybe aren't on our typical go-to reading list from the Bible, to stray a bit off the normal path, Lord, but hopefully to discover you and new insights from you, of you, in it. I pray that we have been diligent in reading your word. Pray that we have been attentive to your Holy Spirit speaking to us through it, both in our private times and here in this gathering. May we honor you in Christ's name. Amen. All right. So the first 7 chapters of the book of Numbers is what you should have read today. If you're like me, you perceive the Numbers to be basically a book that's going to be all about census and perhaps genealogy. After all, it's called Numbers, so we got a taste of that, certainly to begin, and I can assure you that it is not all about those such things. And even I think the first 7 chapters had some interesting topics. At least I will pull one of them out. Hopefully you found more than the one I pull out. This week's assignment coming up is chapters 8 through 14. Chapter 13 and 14, just as a preview, is the famous part where the Israelites are now on the doorstep and they send the spies and all things spiral in bad places. So that happens in the book of Numbers. So that's right around the corner from where we are right now. But before we get ahead of ourselves, again, this week was chapters 1 through 7. Does anybody have any questions, comments, observations you want to share regarding Numbers chapters 1 through 7? Anybody? John? Yes, sir.
Sure.
Hang on one second, John. Let our roving mic get to you.
In chapter 6, they spent quite a bit of time talking about the Nazirite vow.
Yes.
I wanted to make sure first that wasn't your discussion topic.
No, it is not.
Okay.
Thanks for checking.
That was interesting because that was a tradition that carried on for a couple thousand years, really. It meant you just confirmed that you were dedicating yourself to God. Usually it's for a period of 30 to 100 days. And you stayed away from wine, you stayed away from grapes, stayed away from getting your hair cut.
And from corpses.
Yep. But there was also
in case you were otherwise inclined. You
there
can't
was
go near
also a
corpses.
lifetime vow that wasn't mentioned here. Where just like your parents gave you your name, they could commit a baby to a lifetime of being a Nazirite. Some people that we know that happened to was the Samson.
Samson, yep. He's the...
John the Baptist was a Nazirite. Samson, of course, was credited with having superhuman strength. He met a woman named Delilah who asked him where he got his strength from because she was a Philistine and didn't really like him. So eventually he told her that it was because his hair had grown all his life. And his
He
long
finally
hair gave him
relented and
strength
told the truth, right?
because he was a Nazirite and he was supposed to not cut his hair. So she had his hair cut, and then that meant he broke his vow, and then he lost his superhuman strength.
Exactly. So pause right there. So I did the same thing. As I read that, certainly my mind went to Samson. He, to me, was the most memorable of the ones with the Nazirite vow, and indeed your history's correct. But I, like you, paused and said, well, I want to know more about this. So to interject just a little bit, you touched on it, but in my research, the Nazirite vow was essentially a vow for laity, which meant non-Levites. You wouldn't see a Levite take a Nazirite vow because by the fact that they are Levite, they are dedicated to the Lord and they've been called out, and that is going to be my discussion today. But what about the people in the 11 other tribes, and what if any one of them wanted to step up or felt compelled to step up because of a particular circumstance for a limited time, like you said, John? So that's what I found in terms of this Nazirite. To whom would it apply and why? And essentially it was available to non-Levites, as you said, to commit themselves specifically for the Lord, either for a purpose or for a season of perhaps repentance and refocusing on God because they maybe felt like they ran astray. And it did indeed involve the things that you talked about as a physical demonstration to the community. Someone would walk around and in theory the community would know, all right, that guy took a, hey Sean, good to see you. Sorry, that guy took a Nazirite vow because he looks different and all that stuff. So yeah.
I think in the case of Samson, if I remember right, an angel came to his father and told his father to raise Samson as a Nazirite. And then he did that, and he, of course, was the last of the judges before they went to having kings there.
Right. Yep. Very good. Thanks, John. Yeah, that was a topic I did dive a little bit. I think you dove deeper than I did even on all that
Like
stuff.
I said, 1,500 years later, then you had John the Baptist, and he was a Nazarite.
Yeah.
Tradition did carry on.
It did.
for quite a time.
Did indeed. Very good.
Man or woman.
Yep.
Yep.
and all the women.
True.
I have time to look for a woman, but I'm just curious.
Yeah, I don't know that there's a biblical account of a woman that took that vow, but it was not male-centric. Good point. Other comments, questions from the first 7 chapters? Rhonda.
It just seems so fair, the way they did everything. Your tribe may not have been the largest, and so therefore you weren't commanded to give exactly the same thing as a larger. You had maybe fewer, and I just thought it was very fair. Even with the weighing of the silver, all the items that they weighed.
Interesting. Good. Let me, just for those in this room, I think the remote. So Rhonda was observing that her assessment of chapters 1 through 7 seemed to lay out a fair protocol for how these tribes would interact and what role they would play in relation to the greater good, and some part of it seemed to be commensurate to their population or their resources or whatnot. That's a good observation. I hadn't reached that conclusion, and then when you said it, yeah. And that shouldn't surprise us. Right? God is not an unjust God, and so he would see that and realize, okay, maybe this tribe that has, this skill set and doesn't have this, we're gonna be fair about that. We're gonna let each contribute what they can to the Lord's service. Other thoughts, questions? All right. Well, I did want to get into a specific topic, and it's going to be a little bit of a survey, chapters 1 through 7, but focusing primarily on one subset within it. But let's go ahead. Everybody go to chapter 1 of Numbers. I'll do some reading because we're going to jump around a bit, and I don't want to wear Mark out running around with the mics. But in the beginning of chapter 1, in the beginning of the book of Numbers, we have a census. I'll read to you verses 2 and 3. This is God speaking to Moses. Take a census of the entire Israelite community by their clans and their ancestral houses, counting the names of every male one by one. You and Aaron are to gather those who were 20 years old or more by their military divisions, everyone who can serve in Israel's army. So this was a census. This was basically a military census. And the directive was not count everybody, not even count every male 20 and older. These are the fellas who would be called to action if the need arose. And as Rhonda's comments indicated, there was some disparity among the tribes as to the populations of 20-year-old males within their groupings. Recall what the total number of that census resulted in?
603,000.
Yes, very good. And just a couple of more. Specifically, it's the very last. No, it's not. It's verse 46. All those registered numbered 603,550. At least that's what my translation says. Y'all don't have a different number for yours, do you? Okay. So 603,000 20-year-old males are within the 12 tribes of Israel. And let me pause for a second. I'm saying 12 tribes. You may recall, because Joseph was sold and into slavery by his brothers, and we're going to actually circle back to that in a little bit. Typically, the quote 12 tribes excludes Joseph and includes Joseph's kids, and typically it excludes another tribe. This was a tribe whose membership was not included in that census. Do y'all know which tribe I'm referring to? Say it again? All right, go. The Levites. The Levites were not in that military census. And we're going to hang out there. That's going to be our focus, is why that? And admittedly, this lesson may be more of a historical lesson than a life application lesson. I think I've got a couple things at the end that might, bring home so why do we care about this? But specifically, the tribes, if you were to look and just kind of glance, let's just do it together. Glance through chapter 1, verse 20 is talking about the tribe of Reuben, and then 22, Simeon, 24, Gad, 26, Judah, 28 Issachar, 30 Zebulun, 32 Ephraim, who was one of Joseph's sons. In fact, mine says the descendants of Joseph to begin verse 32, and then it breaks down Ephraim, and the next one is Manasseh, who is another son of Joseph. Those are the half-tribes. If you recall, fast-forwarding later, when the land is divided and the half-tribe of so-and-so gets this, those were the two half-tribes which were in theory, well, not in theory, they came from Joseph, and they were sort of Joseph's tribe, although Joseph's tribe never got its own name, for reasons to be discussed later. Chapter 36, or sorry, verse 36, Benjamin, 38 Dan, 40 Asher, 42 Naphtali, and then the total is 603, 550. So missing is Levi. And Levi was missing for a particular reason. Do you recall why the tribe of Levi would have been excluded from this military census? All right, it's getting ahead of ourselves. I think you're going to go to a reason for just more basic than I think where you're going.
Okay.
They were set aside to be priests.
All right, they were set aside to be priests. I think you're going to kind of, why was that? And that's my dive. I'm going to do the dive for that. But yeah, they were called out from the masses to be God's special designated people for a special designated purpose. If you're still in chapter 1, I want you to stay there because we're going to pick up, and I will want a couple of readers. So Mark, I will ask you to walk if you would. But can somebody volunteer to read verses 47 through 53 of chapter 1 of the book of Numbers? Show me by hand so Mark can get to you with the mic. All right, Isaac, you don't have to travel far. Nice. You're welcome, Mark. Go for it, Isaac.
But the Levites were not numbered among them by their father's tribe, for the Lord has spoken to Moses, saying, Only the tribe of Levi you shall not number, nor take a census of them among the children of Israel. But you shall appoint the Levites over the tabernacle of the testimony, over all its furnishings, and over all the things that belong to it. They shall carry the tabernacle and all its furnishings. They shall attend to it and camp around the tabernacle. And when the tabernacle is to go forward, the Levites shall take it down. When the tabernacle is to be set up, the Levites shall set it up. The outsider who comes near shall be put to death. The children of Israel shall pitch their tents, everyone by his own camp, everyone by his own standard, according to their armies. But the Levites shall camp around the tabernacle of the testimony, that there may be no wrath on the congregation of the children of Israel. And the Levites shall keep charge of the tabernacle of the testimony.
Okay, great, wonderful. All right, so this is why God said, don't count the Levites. And he had, in chapter 3, a little further insight into the role of the Levites. Can I get a different reader for verses 5 through 12? And then we're going to dissect those verses, those two passages. Somebody raise your hand so Mark can come to you. Chris, all right? Give us 1 second. All right, again, chapter 3, Chris is going to read verses 5 through 12, if he'd be so kind.
And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Bring the tribe of Levi near, and present them before Aaron the priest, that they may serve him. And they shall attend to his needs and the needs of the whole congregation before the tabernacle of meeting, to do the work of the tabernacle. Also, they shall attend to all the furnishings of the tabernacle of meeting, and to the needs of the children of Israel, to do the work of the tabernacle. And you shall give the Levites to Aaron and his sons. They are given entirely to him from among the children of Israel. So you shall appoint Aaron and his sons, and they shall attend to their priesthood. But the outsider who comes near shall be put to death. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Now behold, I myself have taken the Levites from among the children of Israel, instead of every firstborn who opens the womb among the children of Israel. Therefore, the Levites shall be mine.
All right, perfect. You can stop right there. Thank you. All right, so let's unpack a little bit what Isaac and Chris just read. The Levites were called out. They were to be essentially the temple workers. There was a tabernacle at the time. Fast forward, it's going to become a temple as well. God decided he wanted to have one tribe that would be called out for that purpose, and he decided on a tribe of Levi. We're going to get to, I think, the question that I hadn't asked, but Chris anticipated, and I shut him down from answering. Why? Why the Levites? So we're going to get there in a little bit, but before we get there, so what does that mean? So that means between both what Isaac and Chris read, I think Isaac covered it more, one of the things they're going to do is they're just going to handle the stuff. They're going to be, we might equate it to the church workers. be they staff, be they pastoral staff, be they elders and deacons. We would, our modern context, the Levites would be the ones who would be doing the work of the church, essentially. And in that case, because at this moment in the history of Israel, they didn't have a permanent place with a permanent structure. They had a tabernacle that had to be taken down and hauled off and whatever else. So the Levites were now in charge of doing that too. They were involved in logistics, as it turns out, to take down, to haul off, to set back up, to deal with the furnishings. Every priest was a male Levite. Not every male Levite was a priest, but every priest was a male Levite. The male Levites who weren't priests were in this other mix, and they were involved in doing these other things. And surely there was a role for the women, but we're going to focus on just the men right here to distinguish between the priests and the non-priests. And then also kind of distinguish a little bit what John and I talked about earlier about the Nazirite vow, which was kind of an opportunity for a non-Levite to consecrate himself or herself and partake in some of this. But the specific assignment for Levites is you're not going to be in the military. You guys are not going to take up swords and battle stations and all that. I'm not counting y'all for that. You're going to do this thing, and the rest of the community is going to handle such things as military defense and conquest and whatnot. Let's look here first, and I want to give you a little foreshadowing. So I had Chris stop at a certain part, and then shortly after that, there was a census. My books, my translation of the Bible before verse 14 of chapter 3 says the Levitical census, and yours might say something similar. So God commissions Moses to count the people in the tribe of Levi, specifically the men in the tribe of Levi. And then there was a reference to the Levites being a substitution for God's rightful claim to the firstborn males of all the Israelites. And he's basically saying, I'm going to claim that they all belong to me, but I'm going to take the tribe of Levi as a substitute for them. And then there was a census and a little bit of a disparity, and there was an offering to kind of make up the slight difference, and we don't need to get into all that. But final count was 22,000 males a month old or more that were within the tribe of Levi. And obviously the month-olds weren't serving in the tabernacle. Specifically, the ones who were in the active service were ages 30 to 50. And we find that at the end of chapter 4, because that's a separate count for ones who would be doing the active service. That's verse 48 of chapter 4. The registered men numbered 8,580. From the 3 divisions within the tribe of Levi. Chapter 4 outlines what each of the, I'm saying division, I honestly didn't know how to describe it, because Levi is a tribe, and these aren't really clans per se, but the 3 main, I'm using the word divisions, and that's probably wrong from a theological standpoint, but the 3 divisions within the tribe of Levi are the Kohathites, the Gershonites, and the Merarites. And they each were given different focus responsibility within the greater context of you all are my church workers. You all are the ones who are going to handle the tabernacle, and from your line, from your membership will be the priests that I would call out specifically, but all you non-priests are going to have particular responsibilities. Pause here and think forward, and some of you may not know this or recall this, but think forward to the eventual entry into the promised land. And more than that, the eventual conquest of the promised land, when Joshua, at the end of the book of Joshua, is now saying, okay, we have all this land, and who's going where? And the tribe of Dan, you're going here, and Asher there, and all this. And there is no land, per se, assigned to the tribe of Levi. Because as temple workers and as tabernacle workers, Levi did not, in God's eyes, need land to the extent that these other tribes did, because they weren't going to be farming, and they weren't going to be raising cattle or crops or the other things that the other tribes would be doing for self-sustenance. The Levites are going to be authorized and allowed, as we read back in the book of Leviticus, to partake in some of the offerings that were made. There was 1 or 2, I forget which ones, were off limits, but pretty much everything else, the Levites were to put a portion on the altar, but they could have the rest, and they could eat the rest. That was God's way of providing for the Levites, because he's carving them out. You don't have these responsibilities. You don't have military service. You don't even have farmland. You're going to have cities throughout What they ended up getting was cities, multiple cities within each of the lands, so that there was basically a Levitical presence throughout the land, so that each tribe of Israel would have within its borders Levites that would be available to serve as temple workers and tabernacle workers and church workers in our context, everywhere. So it wasn't like people were without. If you were living out west, you had no presence of the Levites. They were scattered everywhere, but they were in cities. And again, they were supported by the offerings, as we read pretty thoroughly in the book of Leviticus. So the Levites are carved out, and this was sort of, they didn't know all that at this moment in time as we're reading the first 7 chapters of Numbers, but we do know from the first 7 chapters of Numbers they're excluded and excused from military service, specifically because God has called them out. I read that, and I went where Chris went with his anticipated question, why? Why Levi? So I decided, let's go back and let's kind of refresh my own memory, at least, as to the backstory. What happened preceding chapter 1, verse 47, when God says, but don't count the Levites, because I got different plans for them. So let's all go back. We're going to journey together back to the book of Genesis, specifically Genesis chapter 29. I will probably do most of the reading in this segment. Mark, at the end, I'll have some more volunteers, but I think you can sit tight. So Genesis chapter 29 is where we find the boys being born. This is back when Israel was known as Jacob. Recall that he had 2 wives, one that was a surprise to him and one that was his intended bride, and we had a good discussion. Tiffany, vouched for, I think, the virtue that she saw in Leah, even though she wasn't the one that Jacob chose. One of the things that Leah was particularly good at is pumping out kids. She was a productive wife in that regard. Rachel, not as much, as you might recall. So specifically, chapter 29 of the book of Genesis, verse 34 is where we are starting to, this is where we find Levi born, and he is the third. Here I'll read. She is Leah. She conceived again, gave birth to a son, and said, at last my husband will become attached to me because I have borne him 3 sons. Therefore he was named Levi. So the first 3 kids came from Leah. Levi was the third, and because there's 12 tribes of Judah, you know that there's an eventual total of 12. So Levi's, early on in the rankings, he arrives before most of the others. Go to go to chapter 34. So you're going to turn to your right. We're going to be marching to the right, essentially. Chapter 34, so that's, the backstory begins with his birth. He's born of Leah. He's born child number 3, son number 3, I should say. Chapter 34, he is now old enough to not be sucking his thumb. He's doing other things. Chapter 34 in Genesis is the story of essentially a rape. His sister, let me read the beginning, verse 1. Dinah, Leah's daughter, whom she bore to Jacob, went to, So Dinah is Leah's daughter, which means that she is Levi's sister, and not half-sister, but whole sister. If it was Rachel's daughter, then it'd be a half-sister, and that may or may not have affected the behaviors. But Dinah is Levi's full sister, meaning got the same mama and the same daddy. And chapter 34 essentially lays out a rape scenario. And the rapist is infatuated with her and decides to do this without her consent, and then later on wants this girl to be his wife. And eventually the suggestion is, y'all aren't Israelites. We couldn't possibly do that unless you circumcised yourselves. So the rapist and every male in that city was supposed to circumcise themselves. That was, in theory, the payment or the justification to be allowed to possibly marry Dinah, because otherwise you're not qualified. So we get to verse 24. And all this, the male citizens do this. This guy must have had some sway because every male in the city says, okay, we'll do it, Joe, because we know you want to marry, this lady, so we'll do our part. So basically 24s, they're all in pain. They're basically agonizing over what happened. And specifically, chapter 34, verse 25, on the third day, when they were still in pain, two of Jacob's sons, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, took their swords, went into the unsuspecting city, and killed every male. So this is part of the backstory of Levi, the tribe that gets called out to be the church folks, basically. So, and Jacob's not pleased with this, chapter 34, verse 30. Then Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, you have brought trouble on me, making me odious to the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites and the Perizzites. We are few in number. If they unite against us and attack me, I and my household will all be destroyed. And they said, should he have treated our sister like a prostitute? So they're mad, and maybe they're rightful to, clearly they're rightful to be mad. Or does that warrant taking swords and killing the whole city of males? Anyway, this is part of the backstory of Levi. To me, not very impressive so far. Fast forward, turning to your right to chapter 37, is when the brothers are hearing of young Joseph and his fancy dreams about everybody bowing down to him, and Joseph's wearing this fancy suit, coat that none of the rest of them have, and they're out shepherding, and Joseph is dispatched to go find where are your brothers, and as they see him approaching, they say, we're tired of Joseph. We want to be done with Joseph. What can we do? And recall what they ended up doing. You may or may not recall, specifically in verse 21, if you're in chapter 37, that's where you need to be. Verse 21, when Reuben heard this, he tried to save him, meaning Joseph, from them, meaning the rest of his brothers. Let's not take his life. Reuben planned to come back later and rescue Joseph. According to the narrative of chapter 37, Reuben is the only one who is identified as having any opposing view on this plan of getting rid of Joseph, which means Levi was in the crowd that says, let's kill him, and then later on, well, how about we sell him, make some coin off this, and he's still gone, and maybe that's a better deal. So Levi is among the crowd that wants to get rid of him.
He was the oldest brother.
Well, he wasn't the oldest. It was Simeon. Oh yeah, sorry, yeah.
The one that took up,
Good.
courage to not slay him,
Yes.
to sell him for a few coins.
Well, actually, I think Judah was the one who said sell him. But yeah, Reuben's plan all along was, these guys will turn their back, I'm going to rescue Joseph, and I'll deal with what happens. So definitely Reuben had the right idea. The brothers just sort of prevented him from implementing his plan fully. If you go to chapter 46 of Genesis, here's where, just as a little bit of a side note, we see that Levi's three sons are, and that's verse 11, Levi's sons, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. Those are the three divisions that I identified in Numbers chapter 4, so that's where those names come from. Recall at the end of Genesis, specifically chapter 49, that Jacob, I should say, had basically this period of giving what I'll call blessings with air quotations, and some of them didn't seem particularly blessed, including the one that he gives to Simeon and to Levi, the two swordsmen who decide we're going to annihilate this city of the rapists for our daughter, for our sister Dinah. So chapter 49, verses 5 through 7 is what I'm going to read next. Simeon and Levi are brothers. This is Joseph now speaking. He's on his deathbed, essentially, and he is now saying a final word of commendation, charge, blessing, or in this case, something quite different. Let me start over. Chapter 49, verse 5. Simeon and Levi are brothers. Their knives are vicious weapons. May I never enter their council. May I never join their assembly. For in their anger they kill men, and on a whim they hamstring oxen. Their anger is cursed, for it is strong, and their fury, for it is cruel. I will disperse them throughout Jacob and scatter them throughout Israel. Again, thanks, Dad. That's not the kind of thing you kind of want to hear from your dad as his dying comment to you before he moves on to the next brother. So again, as I looked at this and scratching my head on the why the tribe of Levi, I didn't find any clear answers, at least in the book of Genesis. There wasn't any obvious reason why Levi should be bestowed with the task of handling the temple responsibilities and from its membership to be the priests. Fast forward to the book of Exodus. So again, you're traveling to your right. Chapter 2, we meet a very important person in the history of mankind, certainly in the biblical account. Verse 1, now a man from the family of Levi married a Levite woman. The woman became pregnant, gave birth to a son. This is the boy that gets put in the reed baskets in the Nile and is rescued by Pharaoh's daughter, the person we know as Moses. So Moses is a Levite, as is his brother Aaron, as is his sister Miriam, and they're players that we've seen really from the book of Exodus through the present. Then we're going to get to the part that Chris was alluding to, chapter 32 of the book of Exodus. Fast forward to your right a decent bit. 32 is when, in Moses' absence, the people said, we don't know what's come of this fellow Moses. He went up to the mountain, and for all we know, he's dead. We're not allowed to go up there because God said it'd scorch us if we do, so we're staying here. We can't send him a text or call him. We don't know what's going on, although he's just been a long time in coming, and let's go to plan B. Plan B is Aaron, you make an you make an idol for us, and we will worship this idol as, in theory, our God. And Aaron complies and does this stupid thing. And in any event, at the end of this chapter, Moses comes down and he's furious, and God's furious too. And these guys end up having to drink the ground gold that had been used to make the calf. But before then, I want to read chapter 32, verses 25 through 29. Moses saw that the people were out of control, for Aaron had let them get out of control, so that they would be vulnerable to their enemies. And Moses stood at the camp's entrance and said, whoever is for the Lord, come to me. And all the Levites gathered around. Is this the episode you were referencing? Okay. So all the Levites gathered around him. He told them, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Every man fasten his sword to his side. Go back and forth through the camp from entrance to entrance, and each of you kill his brother, his friend, and his neighbor. Sorry, a little drink break. The Levites did as Moses commanded, and about 3,000 men fell dead that day among the people. Afterwards, Moses said, today you have been dedicated to the Lord, since each man went against his son and his brother. Therefore, you have brought a blessing on them yourselves today. All right, and then later on, I think, is when they drink the gold or whatever else. So this was, as in my research, this was sort of the stopping point for things that I could find in Scripture that talked about Levi himself or the tribe of Levi, the good, the bad, the ugly, and there was a smattering of all of the above. And as I thought of the question, why the tribe of Levi, I kind of came to some thoughts, but let me throw it out here for you all. Why did God choose Levi? Of the 12 tribes, some of whom had virtue from the start, some of whom didn't, some of whom were a mixed bag, why Levi? Any thoughts? There's not really a right answer here, so you're not going to, be red X'd if it's not what comes out of your mouth, but just thoughts. Yes?
They took the Lord's requests and demands for cleansing and made it happen amongst all the tribes. So they were the cleansing enforcers.
Okay, good. Good. I think that's accurate. If that's the reason why, we're not sure yet, but that's an accurate assessment, and that may have been the reason why. Other thoughts on the reason why? Okay, they didn't hesitate. It doesn't. Because the call was all who are for the Lord. It wasn't like, hey, Levites, come gather. It was anybody who wants to, and the Levites seemingly went pretty quickly, and no one else seemed to join them, at least according to the narrative. Good. Other thoughts?
If you look back into Genesis, Levi and Simeon, I believe it was, who avenged their daughter's rape.
Right, sister's rape, yep.
I'm sorry, sister's rape, yes. Could you kind of see an undercurrent of belligerent justice, though, or fierce, passionate justice?
I could see an intent for that, yes. I think that's a good point. Their actions certainly seemed to portray their desire to fix what's wrong and to right an injustice. Maybe they shouldn't have done that, but their motives seem to be along those lines. I agree. why I think most of you are either hesitant to speak or aren't quite sure is where I ultimately landed. I think these are good potential explanations. One that I had is because Levi is the tribe of Moses. And Moses is a rock star, and God sees that, and maybe he's blessing Levi because Moses has been so faithful. God doesn't tell us. I mean, the thing I read here talks about to say you've been dedicated to the Lord, so that's maybe as close to God telling us why, because he said that in the context of this episode, and this episode does, I think, identify some of the characteristics that we've heard spoken. But I ultimately landed to the position that we don't really know why. Because, yes, this is a commendable moment. And it's the last moment, so maybe they're judged by their last act, not their first. People are judged how they finish rather than how they start. I wouldn't necessarily attribute that mindset to God. But nonetheless, again, if we look at the whole backstory, there's plenty of things that Levi didn't do that, because of that, was not commendable. Wendy?
Well, and you mentioned Moses. You think about the flaws that Moses had, but God used him so mightily.
Yeah.
And if that's the likeness of this group of people, you know what I mean? Like,
He was a good representative of the tribe of Levi?
yes,
Yeah.
even if they are a flawed people, they are still open to being used by God. And that could be part of it as well.
Good. Great insight. Yes. I mean, I said he's a rock star, and he is, but he expresses his human frustration with the people countless times, and we've read that, and we will read that as we continue through the Torah. I want to be done with this. Yeah, wipe me out if I got to deal with these people. They're driving me nuts.
That's it. Is that right? And I said he killed a guy because of righteous indignation, which sent him running. So that's
It circles back.
That's the same. It's that righteous indignation of that fierce sense of justice, which I think when they see a wrong, they want to correct. Or they want to do something. They won't just sit by and watch.
Good.
The curse that Joseph put, he cursed that anger. So you wonder if God is shaping this anger into something more righteous through that line. And also, he prophesied, he said that they'd be dispersed all throughout Israel.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting, and I just told you in the Joshua, they're going to have cities throughout, not just one chunk of land where they're going to be together. They're going to be dispersed, literally, as Jacob said. Great insights. Isaac.
I was just thinking, because you're talking about like their righteous anger and how they're wanting to take stuff, and then I was thinking, isn't it at the end of Judges, wasn't it a Levite who, he had a concubine, so that was wrong to begin with, but then once she
Do you remember that?
He basically causes the civil war in Israel, where they go and they...
I think so. I recall that episode, and you and I have a specific connection on that episode, but I think it was a Levite. Yeah. So these are plausible, and I'm not saying not correct. They may very well be correct reasons why God chose Levi. If that's the case, I think you've touched on a few points. I'm going to just expand a bit more on Wendy's, because Wendy basically said, despite their flaws, God called them out for a specific use. So one takeaway that we could have from doing this searching through the history of Levi is that despite their flaws, God said, I have a special plan for you. I have a special assignment for you. We can look in the mirror and perhaps, look a lot like them, despite our flaws.
And it gives us hope.
Exactly.
Because Lord knows we're flawed, but God still uses us.
He can still assign to us something mighty, even when our resume wouldn't suggest we're worthy. Yes, Lee.
Why are their flaws different than the rest of the communities, the rest of the tribes? We're all flawed. They were all flawed.
Great.
But something separated their flaws, perhaps, from the majority. So that would be my question.
Yeah.
What is it special about them?
It's a good question. Good question. Another, and I don't have an answer to that question other than it's a good question. Yeah, is their flaws more of a righteous bent versus a self-focused, perhaps? Yeah, it could be that Moses demonstrated the faithfulness and God wanted to bless his people because of him.
Now. I mean, there are people that have that righteous indignation, like that fierce sense of justice that maybe the person next to them doesn't. Like people are wired that way. You either are or you're not, and it almost makes you think that maybe the Levites we're just wired that way.
Could be. But, in that moment, then you could make the case, well, these guys would be great in the military. Why exclude them from the military? These are the ones that break out the swords, and they're fine wiping out people to the left and right. Good point. And again, where I ultimately ended is I felt comfortable that this was the likely reason God chose. He didn't really say as much, and as a result of that, the main takeaway, in addition to the one that we just sort of generated in the class, the main takeaway that I had, and this is where I do want to have three more volunteer readers. Maybe if it's like at one table so Mark isn't room in the whole room, that would be great. Can I get just 3 hands in the air? I promise they're not going to be long readings. One of them is going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 14. Show me the hands first so that Mark, all right, so we're going to go with this area here. So Gary, if you can take 1 Corinthians 14, I'll tell you the specific verse. Patrick, if you go to Hebrews chapter 13, and can get someone near Gary and Patrick for Isaiah chapter 55. And Sean will be that person. Very good. All right, so Gary, you're going to read 1 Corinthians 14, verse 33 when you get there. No rush, you're fine. Just let me put you on the spot there. So before he starts reading, at this point in the lesson, I literally write, so what? So what does this have to do with me? And then my next point is, God does not always reveal the reasons for his decisions. And he didn't really reveal chapter 14, verse 33. So God doesn't always reveal the reason for his decisions, but there's some things we can lean on when we're not sure why God has chosen to do a certain thing or not. So Gary, you should have 1 Corinthians 14, verse 33. Do you?
Okay, for God is not a God of disorder, but of peace, as in all congregations of the Lord's people.
All right, perfect. So this speaks to the fact that God's a God of order, not disorder. Meaning, whatever his reason might be, it's a sensible reason. It's an orderly reason. He is not a God of chaos. He is a God that has a purpose. He is very purposeful. He is obviously he's perfectly wise, but he has order behind his decision because that's his nature. That is who he is. Before you read, Patrick, the account of Genesis is a great illustration. The account of Genesis 1, I should say, is a great illustration of that. If you were to really look at the sequence of creation, everything that followed needed the thing that was created before it in order for that next thing to sustain itself. And likewise, and likewise, and likewise. It is very sequential, very orderly, and it's throughout the Bible. I just call that out as just an example of God as a God of order, which is basically what Gary read. Patrick, if you could read Hebrews 13, verse 8, if I didn't tell you the verse yet.
Verse 8.
Yes, please.
Jesus Christ, the same yesterday and today and forever.
All right, so that says Jesus Christ, who is one of the three persons of God, meaning that this God of order has always been a God of order, will always be a God of order. That will not change. That is who he is. That is his nature. And finally, Sean, if you are at Isaiah 55, if you can read verses 8 through 9. Familiar passage, I'm sure, once you get there.
For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts.
All right, very good. So the last verse basically says, his mind and his operations and his decision making, while there will be times when it seems there is an answer to the why question, why me, why Levites, why now, why whatever else, we might feel like we have an answer because perhaps God is revealing that. Sometimes he does not. Sometimes we're completely confounded by this decision to call me out or to not, or to close a door that I think should be wide open because isn't this surely what God wants me to do and I can't seem to get through this thing. We can lean on the fact that he's a God of order, which means he has purpose to his decisions, that he is consistently that way and will always be consistently that way, and that when we don't understand him because his ways and thoughts are higher than ours, we can trust him. We can lean on the fact that whatever his decision is, it's obviously a good one. And we just need to be faithful in following. And as I looked at the tribe of Levi and look at this question, I had some thoughts as to why the tribe of Levi, and we discussed them, but ultimately, it's God's decision why, and it's not my place to question that or to dispute that. It's my question to inquire. I think that's fair, but to dispute or to second guess is not my place. They faithfully obeyed. He called them out, and they did it. So, the next knock on the door might be the knock on our door saying, I've called you out to do a certain thing. and we can faithfully obey and trust that his decision is purposeful, it's wise, and it's for his good, which is ultimately for ours as well. Let me close in prayer. Lord God, thank you for this passage. Thank you for illustrating perhaps some things to the tribe of Levi that past behaviors do not do one to be irrelevant in your eyes, that you can still use flawed people and have throughout human history, and that we are such people. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to know you and to serve you and to preserving your word so that we might know and serve you better. And I pray these efforts in reading through your word, one chapter a day, is giving us the ability to be more like moldable clay in your hands, that we can be the people you intend. In Christ's name, amen. Thank you.